düşünüyorum.
If
Tekrar
we
geldiğiniz
were
için
doing this
teşekkür ederim.
physically as an offline event,
Bunu
probably
fiziksel olarak
because of
gerçekleştiriyor
your busy
olsaydık
schedule, you wouldn't be able to join us. But now we are
muhtemelen
lucky
yoğun
that
programın yüzünden
you
bize
are here.
katılamayacaktın.
So
O
again,
yüzden
thank you. So
burada olduğun için şanslıyız
I said a
diyebilirim.
few
Tekrar
words
teşekkür ediyorum.
before I invited you on stage about TCV, but it was just a quick short overview. I just said TCV invested in more than 350 companies and invested over $14 billion. Can you give us a little bit a background on TCV? Tell us a little bit about TCV.
Sure. And by the way, thanks again for having me, Arda. Great that you can be here. So TCV is a West Coast investment firm. We started about 25, 26 years ago in the Valley. And I think the mission statement then and the type of companies we're trying to back then, I think is very similar today, which is we're looking to invest in category leaders driven by incredible CEOs and entrepreneurs in markets that we think have multi-decade tailwinds. And from that beginning in the Valley, we've expanded really throughout the rest of the US. We opened an office in New York in 2005. We opened an office in London in 2012. And we've been really investing across the globe for the last number of years. We've invested almost $2 billion now in Europe alone. We've invested in three companies in China and elsewhere in Asia as well, in Asia Pac. And so we're really thinking about TCV today as a global investment firm looking to back kind of category defining technology companies.
So tell us what sets a growth stage investor apart from early stage VC firms or even a buyout investor. Where do you fit in?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think sometimes it's confusing for people. So I think of growth stage as somewhere in between the two. If you think about growth versus VC first, I think we are typically investing in more developed companies. Typically they're bigger companies. I would maybe classify them as probably scale-ups versus startups. Tend to be, I'd say, more concentrated. So we make less investments than a VC, which means we tend to be more involved. We're typically working quite actively at the board with the CEO, founder, management team on various things like maybe it's scaling go-to-market, maybe it's scaling various other aspects of the team, or it's thinking about new geographies. So that really, I think, sets us apart from the VCs. In terms of the buyout kind of classic PE, I think first and foremost, our return is driven by growth, right? And I think that is we're really focused on growth. We're not driven really as much on EBITDA growth, more on revenue growth. It's less about financial engineering. We typically use debt very sparingly. About 80% of TCV's investments have zero debt at all in our investments. And so we're trying to find ways to kind of grow the top line. And that's really kind of where growth equity fits in.
I mean, normally, please correct me if I'm wrong, TCV is a West Coast investor. And can you tell us about how you came to Europe and expanded internationally?
Yeah, so we did start off on the West Coast, and I really think of us today as a global firm. How that really started was quite gradual. I think our first investment outside the US was in a company called Sitecore, which is a Danish business in the old CMS, content management system space, now probably called web customer experience. That was a great investment for us. We invested $100 million, and as a minority, kind of ballpark 40% stake, and ultimately we're able to more than 4 times our investment over the course of 5 years. And what that really solidified for us was a couple of things. First and foremost, that we are seeing great talent really everywhere. And we're seeing it not just outside the Valley, but outside the US. That I think that shift, that realization is really accelerated for us. I think in addition to great talent everywhere, we're also seeing great startups, great scale-ups appearing all over the map. And I think about some of the investments that we followed on from Sitecore, even in Europe, companies like Spotify, companies like World Remit, companies like Revolut, companies like Sportradar. These are kind of global champions in their category, companies that probably wouldn't have been in Europe or elsewhere, 20 years ago. I think of the kind of Booking.com story where, Booking.com has become like the dominant player in global travel. It's a Dutch company that got acquired really early in its life cycle by Priceline, right? And I think that wouldn't happen today because of just the amount of growth equity, VC, and other investment dollars that are trying to find and back great technology entrepreneurs in Europe and elsewhere. And I would say, actually, we've even taken it a step further. I mean, we've made a number of investments recently out in Asia. So we're investors in ByteDance, as you probably know, and we're also investors in Klook, the travel business, as well as SiteMinder down in Australia. So we really think that there's great technology companies, great CEO, talent, management teams all over the world. And in addition to that, I think the ability to start companies outside of the Valley, outside of the US, is easier than ever. The cost is lower than ever. The speed at which you can do it is faster than ever. So we actually expect this trend to only continue, and we want to be a part of that. So if we want to be in the best companies, we need to be international with an international mindset. And I think that's really what spurred it for TCV 9 years ago, and that's only accelerated.
Yeah. So from the point of view of a growth equity investor, how do you look at the current environment for technology investing and adoption?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things. First off and foremost, we think it's a great time to be investing. Well, we feel very lucky that we're investing in technology. We think it's the best sector in the world to be investing in. There's, by definition, almost always
we feel lucky
happening.
that you're investing in technology as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a couple of points I'd make, though. First and foremost, it's getting more competitive. I think that there's a lot more money coming to the category, makes prices higher, makes it more difficult. What we do at TCV, we've thought about this over the years. We try to really steer clear of the macro environment, though. We really think that we're not good at figuring out what the current macro environment is. We really want to focus on the micro, right? And for us, the micro goes back to what I said earlier. Are we investing in a category leader? Is this a great management team with a great CEO? Do we have decade plus tailwinds? If we can get those three things right, we think over the course of time that we'll do well. And so we try to avoid kind of making judgments on the current cycle, albeit knowing that it's getting more competitive. There are strategies that we think we're well placed to be effective in that competitive world, partly because of our focus, our domain expertise, and kind of really sticking to what we know. But yeah, that's how we think about, I guess, the current environment. We just try to focus on the micro.
Yeah. So, I mean, TCV has been in business for almost like 3 decades. What are some of the biggest lessons learned from previous situations? What do you say?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a lot. I'd say first and foremost is have an open mind. I think this is a mistake we continue to make, but I think you have to be open-minded as a technology investor. It's always easy to dismiss things. It's always easy to say, oh, that market, that TAM is only so big. There's only so many customers there. And I think every time we've done that, we've typically got it wrong. I think part and parcel of that, by the way, relates to my previous answer, which is having a kind of international mindset and a global mindset. If you think about even the great companies we back in the Valley, Netflix, Facebook, etc., a huge part of their growth has been internationally, right? These are parts of the business that we never thought would be as big and then be ultimately bigger than the US business. So I think really having an open mind on the size of the opportunity is something that's very important. It's a big mistake we've made, we continue to make, and we try to make that mistake as little as possible. The other thing I'd say on mistakes is that, at least on this more of a personal note, I mentioned earlier about getting the market right. I think if you don't get the market right, it's just very, very difficult to pivot. That said, I think backing the right teams is really, really important. Great teams can execute through difficult times. I think about Facebook as an example where we invested in the kind of 2011 era, just as they were kind of thinking about pivoting to mobile. And that is, I think if you look at, there's a bunch of other companies that were competing with them for mind share at that time, but I think the execution from Facebook was second to none. And you saw the results, right? It was, the company became 10, 20, 30x bigger than its competitors. And so making sure you get the right team on board, you're behind the right team, I think is really, really critical and something that we've continued to focus on.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are so many things going on in technology, but what themes and sub-sectors are you spending the most time on right now?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there are a lot of themes, as you say. We try to be quite micro-specialized in the themes we go after. A couple of themes that I should mention. First and foremost, I would say anything around vertical SaaS we think is pretty interesting. I think there's an entire SaaSification of entire industries going on, digitization of entire industries, and so we continue to spend time there. We think that supply chain, the whole digitization of supply chain is really interesting. We made a big bet in Europe about 18 months ago in a company, 2 years ago now, in a company called Relex, which is digitizing forecasting and replenishment out of Finland. We've been very active in the digital payment side. We think digital payments will continue to be a growth area. It's a very nice entry point, we think, to work with customers. There's a ton of additional products that you can provide besides just payments. We've invested most recently. We also think a lot of these digital payment companies will be beneficiaries from some of the changes in behavior. We'll see how real they are and how sustainable they are over time, but some of the changes in behavior because of what we've seen in 2020. Businesses like Molly, which is a Dutch PSP focused on the SMB segment. On the back of that, we invested in a business called Klarna in Sweden, which is really innovative in the pay later space, focused on providing really innovative solutions for millennials and others around the world. We've also backed companies like Revolut, which although it's a digital bank, also is really prominent in the payment side, right? A lot of its revenue comes from people using it as a payment service. World Remit, which I mentioned earlier, is a cross-border digital payments company. And then there's others like Payoneer, RMS. So within Europe alone, we've made 5 or 6 investments in digital payments, and we think that is going to continue to be a really interesting category. The other category that we think is still early innings is in marketplaces. You guys in Turkey have some very unique and interesting marketplaces. I think there's a number of very nice marketplace businesses across Europe, some that are across multiple geographies and certain verticals, some that are kind of local champions. We think there's a lot you can do in those businesses to provide value to your customers and ultimately become a successful business over time.
Wow, it was great because I wrote down 3 bullets for each markets and subsector you mentioned: supply chain, digital payments, and marketplaces. It's so valuable. This information is so valuable for our audience, and I hope we hear an investment from TCV in Turkey in some of these categories, but we're going to talk about it later. So I'm just going to move on. At the end, I have a Turkey-specific question to you. Let's move on now. So you mentioned really good companies that you invested in in the last couple of years or before. So how does TCV find those opportunities in Europe and globally?
Yeah, so I think it's a mixture of 2 things. First and foremost, I mentioned the micro-specialization. We try to be quite thematic. We build market maps, for example, of certain industries that we track over time. I think supply chain is a great example. When I first joined TCV in 2012, I noticed they had a bunch of these market maps for various sectors. Supply chain was one. And over the years, we've kind of updated that. And as we were updating it, we saw that, for example, in the forecasting and replenishment side, many of the customers in the category were going through a refresh cycle. And they weren't just going through a refresh cycle, but they were using either technology that was 20 years old, on-prem, batch-oriented, moving towards things like RELX, which was in-memory database, real-time, giving great visibility to customers into demand on the customer side as well as on the inventory side. And so those type of market building market map building exercises create ideas for us. We then go and try to figure out, okay, which parts of this value chain do we want to play? What are the competitive dynamics like? We try to meet as many companies as we can in the category and ultimately make a bet. I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it goes back to what I said earlier about being open-minded is I don't think you can really do that market map building for businesses like Airbnb, which we backed, or businesses like Uber. Some of these businesses come out of nowhere. I don't think anybody could have thought about the emergence of those businesses. And so I think it's a combination of being very thematic, but also opportunistic and open-minded and seeing where things go and kind of getting to know the CEOs and understanding the visions they might have there. And I said earlier, I think if you think about the size of the TAM for many of these businesses, it's many, many multiples bigger than we all thought they were going to be 10 years ago.
Yeah, you're right. So there's one thing our audience probably never heard about you. They have no idea, but I know. You were a professional tennis player and you competed on the men's professional tennis tour and were a member of the Irish Davis Cup team from 1996 to 2004. Is that right? So, yeah. Are there any lessons from sports that you made you a better investor?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'll say if I was a great tennis player, I probably wouldn't be here today. So, I come from a relatively small country, and so playing Davis Cup for Ireland was probably easier than other places. But I would say a couple of things. First and foremost, playing on the tour is a grind. It's a slog. It's a difficult job. And part of the reason is that you pretty much lose every week, right? Very few people win the tournament, and so that kind of mindset, I think, the ability to kind of keep going. The ability to kind of take losses, and then finally when you win, the elation is really incredibly rewarding. I think it's very similar when you think about investing. Most of the companies that we end up talking to, for one reason or another, we don't get to invest, right? And so having the perseverance to kind of pick yourself up and keep going, and then finding that one company, and then fundamentally when you partner with a great founder, CEO, a great company, the elation that you feel when you're a part of something that's really great, I think it really makes it all worth it. So in many, many ways, I feel like being on the tour was a pretty good preparation for this role.
Cool. So one last quick question to you. Is Turkey under your radar at the moment? Because we saw some really good exits in Turkey, some really good companies growing, and also some very good investments happened, surprisingly, during the pandemic. Is Turkey under your radar, or do you see any opportunities in Turkey?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, this is probably the easiest question you've asked, Arda. I've been in Turkey for the last probably 15 to 16 times over the last 9 years. I think it's one of the most exciting markets, if not the most exciting opportunity over the next decade for us at TCV in Europe. A couple of reasons for that. And by the way, before I go there, I said we've been close. We've not made an investment in Turkey, but we've met some great companies, some great CEOs, and we've been close. And for one reason or another, like I said earlier, you don't always get to make an investment. But we think that the Turkish technology ecosystem is really exciting and innovative. Not to mention the fact that there's some great earlier stage venture investors there too, backing some great companies, and we know some of those guys. I think that our strategy in Turkey is going to be the following. We think that many of the themes I mentioned to you are as relevant, if not more relevant, in Turkey than elsewhere. Part of the reason for that is you have an incredibly dynamic young population. You've got an incredibly digitally native population relative to Europe, and I think you also have you have a very big population, which, by the way, is important if you think about global champions in Europe. If I think about, for example, in classifieds, or if I think about digital marketplaces, you can build a really big business just in Turkey, right? There's many, many countries in Europe where you just can't do that, right? It's just not big enough. And so we've also seen incredibly innovative businesses in Turkey where, whether it's on the delivery side, logistics side, I think some of the creativity that we're seeing, I wouldn't be surprised if you see Turkish, I want to say scale-ups at this point, really go on to be global champions in the way that I've expressed earlier. That would not surprise. In fact, I expect that over the next kind of 3 to 5 years. It's part of the reason, by the way, I wanted to do this conference today. I wish I was there in person, quite frankly, because I'm very, very bullish on Turkey, and hopefully we can find something to do there in the short term.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, I really wish we could do this in person. Hopefully next year, or I don't know. We have many other conferences during the year. So when things are better, more healthy, when we are get rid of this, pandemic, hopefully we'll see you in person at one of our conferences. John, thanks for joining us. It was a pleasure for us. It was an honor. I asked you like 9 questions and we finished it in 20 minutes. It's a world record for a conference. Thanks for great answers and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Arda. Great to talk to you. Cheers.
Yep. Have a good day.